Hey, good morning. My name is Kendall McDaniel. I am a senior at ASU. I am getting my BA in Museum Studies in May. So I'm pretty excited to graduate, but this week I'll be kind of leading the presentation on Unit 2, the moving panorama. So it's based off of the reading from our author, Erki Hutamo. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce that name. So we're gonna dive right in. I'm kind of reading this. We received excerpts from his book, so that's kind of what it is. I checked out his book online. It looks really interesting. There were a couple other things that I'm going to be referencing while we're going along in this presentation. In the written section of the presentation, I've included all of the YouTube links and links to any other readings that I had found. So if you guys go ahead or want to check it out, it's all right there for you. I will be asking some questions during the reading, but I've also, again, typed all those questions out in the posting. So it's just a little bit easier for our discussion because this is a 15-minute presentation. So yeah. Anyways, really interesting learning about the panorama. Obviously, it has a lot of influence on our current technological cinema world. And then this article is really interesting because instead of just focusing on panorama as an art form, it really asks a lot of good questions about kind of our culture and how we kind of represent or get put into these art forms, how our economy affects that, the art market, and so kind of diving into a couple of those themes. So let's get started. You can just follow along. I just have the reading in front of me, and that's what I'll be looking at is whatever notes that I've written on there. So kind of in the front page, he really just dives into the definition, obviously, of a panorama starting in the 1790s. We kind of see this idea that the panorama is really celebrated for being big, which I think is a question that kind of not haunts the contemporary art world, but a little bit. We see a lot of artists that have really simplistic ideas, and because their pieces are bigger, I think this attracts a lot of buyers and just a lot of patrons in general. So I think panoramas really succumb to that idea that bigger is better. Later on, we'll see a couple artists have kind of a stone throwing contest as far as whose panorama is longer, and that not a sexual innuendo, but really that's what happened. So yeah, I think that we can kind of see themes of that in our contemporary art market right now, as far as the concept of bigger being better, or just kind of making an art piece right off the bat. So he kind of gets into the description of panoramas and what they are. We see the 1700s. Robert Barker is kind of, he just develops this landscape of Europe, and it's coined as an improvement to the art of painting. So it really just, it encapsulates this landscape of Europe, and then it brings your viewer in, so as if they're really on that very spot looking at it. So that's kind of, I think, where the glamorization of panoramas come from, is it really just immerses the viewer into the painting right away, and so they feel like they're there. Then on page 4, he goes into the definition of the word. It replaces a French word, which was view at a glance, and so it's a Greek word, actually. I thought that was really interesting, how he talks about how the revolution really had an influence on that, as far as replacing a French word, because the French weren't really favorable at that point in history. So that was really interesting. So then later on he vaguely talks about media culture on page 5, and that's going to obviously be one of the questions that we talk about a little bit later in this discussion, this idea of media culture. So it's capable, a panorama is capable of teleporting its audience to another location and dissolving the boundary between local existence and global vision. So we kind of already see these themes coming together as far as during that time period, we see mass tourism being a thing. So people are wanting to travel, obviously with steam engines and trains kind of being innovated and replacing like the horse and cart buggies. We see a lot more people taking trips. And then for the classes that aren't able to take trips, we see panoramas being developed. I thought that was interesting though, because he does talk about how the middle class doesn't really get into panoramas, obviously, as much as the upper class does. And so that maybe it goes into the idea of landscapes being popular because the upper class wants to see places without having to be there. And so it kind of develops you into this global citizen he talks about on page 5. But really just this idea that you're cultured and like know what's going on, essentially. So I wrote, panoramas allowed for people to feel as though they are really there without having to be there, especially at this time of mass tourism. So just it kind of really, really goes into that. So that beginning chapter, page 1 through 5 really just talks about the painted panorama, this circular panorama. I'm going to be referencing an article from a doctor from New Jersey at the Montclair Art Museum, and he writes about the circular panoramas just a little bit more in depth. He really goes into, John Bernard Banvard actually has, he really goes into Robert Barker's circular panoramas a little bit more. And if you want to reference that article, again, I put it in the written text, but it just really goes in depth more of how a circular panorama was created. And then later on he talks about John Bernard Banvard and how this motion picture panorama. So on page 6, our article references the motion panorama, which I think is really just kind of the biggest thing. Immediately I thought of Yesterland from Disneyland. I don't know if any of you guys have been there, but you're sitting in an audience and basically it's this giant wheel that you're watching something happen. So first we have the circular panoramas, and then we have these painted panoramas that are kind of put on a wheel. And then we get evolve into the more theatrical version of a panorama. And that would be kind of like more Yesterland. And so people are actually acting it out, and or there's a tour guide who's there to really kind of explain it a little bit more in depth. So the mobile and kind of this idea that people are able to see it when they want. He goes in, our author goes into the idea of traveling panoramas. So going from world fairs, which isn't until the 1900s. So by then they had actually developed film. But before then, going from city to city or being adopted, a lot of European panoramas would come over here to the US because obviously they wanted to be able to see what it was like in Europe. So on page 8, and this is just, it's not really necessarily a question, but it was something that I was interested in. He says, the cunning showman assured their audience that their shows were uplifting, morale, and suitable even for children and clergymen. I kind of got this weird vibe from that, kind of like a sultry undertone, that really maybe some of the ideas of these like theatrical panoramas were, because they're steeped in a daily life kind of reality, that maybe they're supposed to be a little bit more sinister than kind of these uplifting landscapes. I didn't really find anything to support that, but when they talk about urban products and kind of these social attitudes, they're really steeping it in reality, which is not necessarily a fantastical representation. And so kind of that idea that because it was more based on the day-to-day life, that it was a little bit more intense that people let on. So, all right, so page 10, we get into this question of academic historians versus innovative technology in art. So one of the questions that I ask as we talk about this, just think about it, but what do you guys think about this academic concept? The fact that, and this is question one, so the fact that art historians don't really study panoramas as seriously, do you guys think that they should, or that they kind of are studied an efficient amount? The reason it was a question is because there is still a lot of artistry that takes place, especially in these hand-painted ones. You still get to see a lot of talent, and they still have to be good artists. I did include a link for the, let's see. Okay, so the first link that I included at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, it shows the installation of a panorama, and so kind of you see that the actual canvas, the painting itself, is an art piece within itself, but then also the technology that it takes to install it, and actually like the machine that it takes to move it around is where the technology and innovation comes in. And so because we're posing that question, it really just asks, should this like technological advancement be considered by art historians? And especially now that we're getting into like a more technological age, should art pieces that revolve around technology be considered in an academic sense? I personally think that they do. Obviously, the panorama had a lot of influence on cinematic culture and how we kind of view movies. We look at like Thomas Edison had his first panoramas at the World Fair in the 1900s. They were live film, so I didn't really include the link because it doesn't, I guess I could have, but it doesn't go into painting. But look it up. Thomas Edison, 1900s, Chicago World Fair. So that kind of goes into how the painted panoramas kind of influenced, obviously, cinematic culture. So I personally think that we should, as art historians, be considering the importance of technology in art, and to kind of shy away from that, I think, is a little bit ignorant. But let me know what you guys think. So that was one of my posted questions. This video is getting kind of long, so I'm going to go ahead. If you look on page 15, our author talks about Jeffrey Ruggles, and he goes more in depth to how these paintings were made and important. So just go ahead and take a look at that really quick. But all right, page 16, we talk about the topi. So I looked this up on Google because I didn't know that that was. So it's actually just a plural noun of topos, meaning a traditional theme or formula in literature. I think when we talked about topi here, it really is just kind of that cultural manifestation of traditions within our art. So really read that page because I think that's so interesting. And it kind of influences the question, the last question, but what is media culture? So how does, when considering that question, number 4, just really think about topoi and kind of how our cultural traditions influence media culture and how that's going to develop in the future, because I think there's a lot of ways that we can predict what's going to happen by things that obviously have already happened. So question number 2 is based off of page 17 in our reading. So I asked, do you agree with Kittler and Foucault that machines are shaping media and signal an end to humanity, or do you agree with our author that human interaction actually molds the media? So I actually bought Kittler's book. I haven't started reading it yet, but it just sounded really interesting. And so I'm excited to like dive deeper into that question because he really focuses on obviously the transformation of technology and how it affects our modern world. He has a little bit more of a like pessimistic view, just really stating that the digital revolution signals the end of media history. So that's kind of sad. But what do you guys think? I thought that the author Hutamo made up a good point that humans who connect with media spectacles with other humans in mind. So we really just, art and movies and music really bring people together, and this kind of collaboration really breeds more innovation and more important technology and art. So I think both sides are really valid and very interesting, but just something to look at. So kind of moving on again, we're going to go over, so page 169, we jump forward to chapter 6. It was an interesting read, nothing really crazy in there. They just talk about the history of the Panorama and really dives deep into the kind of importance, especially with John Benvard. It says, John Benvard, or The Making of a Myth. So he's kind of this American author, artist. The biggest takeaway I had from that was the importance of branding, which I am want to go into curating. And so my biggest thing when I work with local artists is talking to them about how can you brand yourself, because really that's what's selling your artwork in today's day and age. We talk a lot about Instagrammable museum pieces, and how that has really changed and shifted our idea of the museum experience. So John Benvard is a really good example about that. He really just kind of put these stories out there that he was this insane, crazy frontier man. And not to say that he wasn't, but that really sold a lot of pieces. So I think it's just important to know. And it was very, very interesting. So self-promotion and branding, if you're a local artist, is very, very important. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but page 181 talks about religion and how that obviously affects panoramas. I did put the moving panorama of Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress. You can see that in the YouTube video that I posted, just because it came up a lot. And I thought it was a really good example of the painted panorama. So they have a whole website dedicated to it. The Psycho Maine Museum is really invested into this panorama. So check it out. Pretty cool. Nothing crazy. But it is a really good representation. So I thought it was the best example. Kind of continuing on to page 188 and 189, it really dives deep into the importance of Mississippi. So we see a lot of panoramas obviously taking place on the river. I think because of steamboats, that was something you could go and see without actually seeing. This culture then transfers over and focuses on Nigeria, which is interesting. And I thought I would love to dive deeper into that, of why Mississippi and Nigeria are connected. Obviously, just having the African culture tied into the South, and everyone was very fascinated with it. So Nigeria kind of became a focus for a lot of panoramas too. So Mississippi and Nigeria. All right, so then we see on page 194 this oversaturation of the market, kind of leading to better quality pieces. So if you have an oversaturation, then you want better pieces, obviously. That's just basic economics. So we see the Gallery of Illustration actually starting to backlight their panoramas and create this, it even freaking says, movie theater type feel. So if you don't think that panoramas have an influence on cinema, you're crazy. So it kind of goes into the disillusion of that. Very interesting. So page 361, we kind of wrap it up, come to an end. So the first sentence is asks again, who are the real protagonists, the machines or the people, human, obviously. So that ties into your question number 2, if you want to reference that at all. But what you guys think about Hitler versus our author, Hutamo. And so that's very interesting. So page 363, I think the biggest thing coming from panoramas that was interesting was that they chose to focus on daily life and real geographical locations when they could have easily focused it on paintings we see in the Renaissance, where it's just kind of this fantasy fascination with fictional narratives. So I think that has a lot to do, again, with what we talked about, mass tourism, and just this idea of wanting to go somewhere without actually having to go there. So that's just another really big question. and kind of focusing on that. And then last but not least, what is media culture? So I think that's kind of the end of the reading, is it really just wraps around as like, what do you guys think of media culture? I put a YouTube video at the end of that question as well. And it kind of dives deeper into the literal definition of media culture. But yeah, what do you guys think about it? So that kind of wraps up our reading. I thought this article was really good, and the fact that it obviously talks about panoramas, but more so how technology and art kind of have an existing relationship steeped in a lot of history. And then nowadays we can definitely see that manifesting a billion times more. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. But again, I've posted all the questions and everything, so they should be all right there, really easy to access, and then we can get a discussion going. So, thank you.